Richard Burgon's peace pledge has been attacked in the press and ridiculed by so-called Labour moderates. Suffice to say, it's been widely misunderstood and misrepresented. So from a legal perspective, I'm going to take a look at what exactly the peace pledge is and how it would work. The peace pledge is one of the 3 central pledges of Richard Burgon's deputy leadership campaign. And the idea is fairly simple. Whenever there's a proposal by the government to deploy the British Armed Forces, the Labour Party's position on whether to back that military action in Parliament should be decided by a vote of Labour members, except in the case of a genuine national emergency or if there is United Nations backing. The first thing to say is that this isn't actually a new idea. In fact, this is precisely what happened in 2015 when David Cameron sought to achieve parliamentary backing for his proposal to bomb the Syrian city of Raqqa. Jeremy Corbyn, unsurprisingly, wanted Labour MPs to vote against that proposal, but faced significant opposition from within the Parliamentary Labour Party. In the midst of threats of rebellion, Jeremy Corbyn sent an email to all Labour Party members, affiliates and registered supporters on Friday the 27th of November 2015 to ask them to participate in an online consultation. That consultation lasted over the weekend, and within that short time frame, a whopping 107,875 people responded, 75% of whom were opposed to airstrikes, whilst only 13% were in favour. The consultation generated a huge amount of debate, and it was an innovative way of approaching policymaking on such a controversial issue. Whilst it was initially predicted that around 115 Labour MPs would defy Jeremy Corbyn and join the Conservatives in voting for the airstrikes, only 66 Labour MPs ultimately did so. It was still a major upset, of course, but many Labour MPs clearly thought twice after seeing the vast opposition from their fellow party members. So why has this proposal, which would simply formalise Jeremy Corbyn's previous approach, been so controversial? The first reason, in my view, is a misunderstanding of the royal prerogative, powers exercised by the Prime Minister. And I suspect that's because most people simply don't know what the royal prerogative is, nor how it works. Despite the fact that Parliament is supreme and the monarch essentially only has a ceremonial role nowadays, the monarch still has a residue of discretionary powers that have never been taken away from them, going back a millennium to when the monarch was still a powerful political figure. Now, the Queen obviously doesn't exercise these undemocratic powers herself. We say that these prerogative powers are exercised by Her Majesty's government, in other words, by the Prime Minister and by the Cabinet. One of the major prerogative powers is the deployment of the armed forces. That means it's a decision for the Prime Minister, not Parliament, to take military action. If that's the case, why have we seen on numerous occasions MPs voting on whether to deploy the armed forces? The answer is that in 2003, Tony Blair, in a rather novel move, decided to put a vote before Parliament in order to gain its approval for his proposal to aid a US-led invasion of Iraq, something he didn't have to do. However, unlike many armed conflicts before it, the proposed invasion of Iraq was unique in its extreme unpopularity, and there were several months of heated debate before the eventual invasion took place. In the UK, over 1 million people flooded onto the streets to protest, and there was large opposition within the country as a whole. So for Tony Blair, to gain a majority vote in Parliament would achieve 2 principal outcomes. Firstly, it would share the responsibility of deploying the armed forces, the principle being that the more people who could be implicated, the less blame would be assigned to any single individual. Secondly, in a way, it would legitimise his actions. Were Blair to have simply exercised the royal prerogative in the face of popular opposition, there would be a bigger case to call the invasion illegitimate and undemocratic. But if the democratically elected Parliament is on side, well, then that argument is undermined. Now, whilst Blair took this new step, it was nevertheless a personal decision. It didn't establish a new convention, nor did it affect a change in the law. But regardless, since that time, it seems Parliament now expected to be given a vote on matters of war. So take, for example, the intervention in Libya in 2011, the proposed bombing of Syria in 2013, and the actual bombing of Syria in 2015. The 2013 example is particularly important because even though David Cameron lost that vote, he could have gone ahead and took action anyway, but he seemed to view the consent of Parliament as being vital.
Can the Prime Minister confirm to the House that he will not use the royal prerogative?
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
Fast forward to 2018. Theresa May joined the USA and France in launching airstrikes in Syria without calling a parliamentary vote. 15 years after Iraq, she broke the cycle in a move that shocked many. Richard Burgon's proposal would do nothing to change any of this. That's not to say that prerogative powers can't be removed. They can. It would, however, require an Act of Parliament. Take, for example, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Before 2011, the Prime Minister had the prerogative to dissolve Parliament at their leisure. Now, however, there has to be a 2/3 majority vote in Parliament. Interestingly, the last Labour manifesto proposed to do the exact same thing to the Armed Forces prerogative by creating a War Powers Act, which would enshrine in our constitution that the government must seek parliamentary approval before engaging in military action. I only mention this because one of the criticisms of Richard Burgon's proposal was that it would prevent military action in a crisis situation, supposedly putting our national security at risk whilst we waited for Labour members to have their say. That absurd accusation was made, by the way, despite the fact that Burgon had already ruled out consulting Labour members in times of national emergencies. If anything, the Labour manifesto pledge of a War Powers Act is a much more controversial proposal, and that's why I say that much of the condemnation of the Peace Pledge is simply disingenuous. But it's also important to understand that there are hardly ever any circumstances, at least in recent times, in which the armed forces have had to be deployed at light speed. Most of the military action that Britain has been involved in over the last century took several days, if not weeks or months of agonising and debating to finally reach a climax. In almost every imaginable circumstance, there would be plenty of time to consult Labour members and to have a vote in Parliament. So the reality is that Richard Burgon's proposal is neither new nor particularly radical. The opposition it's received has largely come from people who don't seem to understand the British Constitution, from people who are being disingenuous, and from people who clearly see no need to address the current warmongering foreign policy of the United Kingdom. The Peace Pledge is a common sense idea that would empower the Labour membership to determine the party's position on matters of war and peace. It would do nothing to stop Labour MPs voting in their preferred way, nor would it remove the Prime Minister's royal prerogative power. But it would mean that Labour members are given the opportunity to set party policy in the hope that our elected representatives will listen and vote accordingly. So never again will Labour members have to protest, not in our name, against their own party.
We keep each other near until